All right. So the the top 100 albums of 2022 took me, God, probably weeks to compile, a whole year to write about, right? And I think by the time that I checked, I had written 660,000 words this year on this site. And I think there's probably like 470 posts overall and whatnot. So when I went in to tally how many albums I actually covered, which I do keep as like an automatic data set, it was it was more than 400 albums, right? Because a lot of these were 10 item lists, 7, 8 item lists, and, you know, that kind of thing. So I had probably something like 1,500 albums to choose from that I listened to at least once or twice, and then about 400 which I'd listened to quite a lot more than that. So making this list really came down to picking based on scores first, and then keeping track of number of listens, which I do through a system, an automatic data collection. I data mine myself and my own habits to make sure I know what I actually like and don't like, and basically from that point, I start to, we have the 20 item lists every month that sort of create an artificial hierarchy to begin with, and then I pull in things that I didn't cover on the site. So there's not as many this year, but there's been years where I've got anything from like synth punk to noise rock and hardcore punk on the list. This year there were so many releases that I liked in metal that it really does dominate this list. Um, so I got to say up front, 100 was not enough. I probably had a list of 300 things that I wanted to talk about at the end of the year that I couldn't cover. Um, the only reason that like the top, like anything from 50 up to 100 was really hard to begin to organize because uh, there was 200 things above that that kept fighting to get in there. So at some point, I just had to sit down and go with the gut feeling. That's really what this always comes down to is the taking whittling it down to 200 items and then doing as much processing as I can within about, beyond what I've done throughout the year to put this together. So it is anyway, this was a considered list, all right? And the order was not just thrown together. I don't care if I'm friends with the band. I don't care if I know the label. I don't care if, I'm not trying to impress goddamn anyone with this. These are honest opinions that have no, I'm not trying to make money. I'm not trying to make friends. I'm keeping track of the best shit for my own sake just as well as anyone, more than anyone else's really. Because I go through so much music. So fuck all you. I'm just trying to keep track of my own bullshit, right? Anyway, so I do have standards, and I do have a pretty complex rubric that I don't really fully reveal for the sake of, I don't know, it's not that interesting. But the amount of time and fixation on a record is kept track of. My own personal connection is, how much I remember it first to 30th listen and beyond. Uh, Appreciating, understanding, and delving into the themes, the lyrics, and the expressivity of the album through its meaning. Meaning is very important to me in music, and the intent of the artist is important. If you don't care, I don't care unless you're cool, right? Sometimes bands are just cool. Impressive audio and visual style is very important. I hope that there are no shitty album covers on this list because I'll be disappointed, right? I think that your album cover, your logo, your band pictures, what you have to say about your music, it all matters, and so does production values, and not so much that they're good, but that they're stylized, appropriate, and worked on. Um, so the lasting value of each album really does make this as subjective as possible because, well, in a way, you could take it as the objective tiebreaker because I've just listened to an album more naturally. But what I mean is, how long is that going to sit on my shelf before I put it up for sale on Discogs because I'm bored with it and I'm done with it? You know, because there's a lot. There are archives, and I have more shelves full of records all over the house. So I consider: did I buy it? Did it sit on my shelf, and is it still sitting on my shelf? And when I have them all piled into one bunch, am I going to keep that record? Well, in 5 years, 10 years, it's a lot to consider. And obviously, I'm a crazy person for doing all of it, but it matters to me because I like this stuff, obviously. So before you get sick of my voice, uh, I generally like to thank people for, some people throw money at me when I write, some people send me music because I write. All of that is awesome, and I really appreciate it. I think that, yeah, it doesn't just give me something to do. It's pretty important to me that I'm able and privileged enough to follow all of this stuff, and that's why I put so much time into it. So, the first thing I'll do is basically I'm going to go through um, at least 25 records on this first video and basically just mention them and give a little bit of an anecdote because it's not that these were less important, but I don't think that I literally couldn't write a post that long without the having memory issues with the computer because there's so many images and embeds on this list. So bear with me here. Uh, so we started at 100 with Antigama's Whiteout on Self Made God Records, and I think this record label does a great job of finding authentic and just killer grindcore records, death grind records from bands that have good reputations both live and otherwise, or just have like historical value or just consistent output. And I think Antigama, it's a Polish grindcore band who heavily resemble kind of the best era of Napalm Death beyond their honestly shitty mid 90s, whatever the fuck that was, right? So, and what I mean is the late 90s and early 2000s stuff they put out, like Enemy of the Music. I guess those were 2000s, right? Enemy of the Music Business and Order of the Leech are all over what Antigam are doing now. They used to be more of an avant-garde band that had some modern hardcore influences, but they put out a lot of records since then, and they've really focused in on what they're best at. And this record just hits right away with the riffs. It's a great record. It's some of the best performances you'll hear all year, and a lot of them are pretty catchy, and just there's tons of energy in that record, and it's good stuff. Vanum's Legend. Now, uh, I was never all that blown away by Vanum. I think that they needed something more than what they had been doing at that, with that, I guess the first record. And with Legend, they introduced basically just kind of added heavy metal to the equation and leads and just amped up their vision for what they were doing, and it paid off. It's a great record. It's one that I returned to for several months after I reviewed it, and uh, I think the thing is that like Profound Lore put out like something like 25 records this year that were all great. And so I couldn't put them all on this list because that would be kind of cheesy. You'll find some record labels repeat on here quite a bit, but uh, I had to prioritize. But I couldn't leave Phantom off the top 100. So if that says anything, Strange Horizon is a Scandinavian. I can't remember if they're Swedish. I think they're Norwegian. Uh, Traditional heavy doom metal band, and much more in the fresh off the 1979 boat sort of way. Beyond the Strange Horizon is, I guess you could kind of relate what they do on this record somewhere between the sort of witchcraft side of things and the Reverend Bizarre kind of things. And it's a really good balance and it works really well. It's the whole record has this handmade sort of 70s heavy rock, doom rock feeling, which I enjoyed and I kept coming back to. Um, so, Veemer is a uh, melodic black metal band from, I think, the Atlanta area who put out a pretty memorable record. I think their first record was pretty memorable, but this one takes kicks everything up a step. They it's much finer work. The drummer is much better this time around, and it really invokes what I like about melodic black metal, and still touches upon modern atmospheric conventions. You know, like a Wolves in the Throne Room fan could still enjoy this record, even though it's 10 times more intense in terms of pacing. So there's a balance there between modern and classic and atmosphere and melody that still manages to be like a brutal and enjoyable experience for that kind of thing. And I found a lot of people really enjoyed it, but they kind of just skipped past it later in the year. So I felt like that's a record that I remembered and enjoyed and wanted to mention. Uh, De Profundis is a British progressive death metal band. They started out, I guess I would compare their earlier work to something like Opeth. And over the years, they've stepped into something more comparable to, let's say, a progressive death metal band influenced by early 90s progressive death metal, as well as, things like At the Gates and whatnot. This isn't a primarily melodic death metal album, but it is melodic. And what'll stand out for most people is the bass performances. They've once again uh, changed staff in terms of the bass player. I don't know if this is a session or a member uh, of the band now, but he's fantastic and really shines all over this record. A lot of people don't like the kind of farty sound of progressive death metal bass playing, but I particularly love it. So it really stood out for me, and it was important that the guitar work was quite good too. Worms. Let's see. This is a French melodic black metal band, and one which stood out to me right away for its songwriting. I think when I put on a black metal record, I don't go into it with any expectations other than the album cover doesn't suck and the recording sounds stylized. We got that with this. And stepping into the work, I think there's a lot of really redeeming qualities to the way they approach this sound, which is somewhere between uh, the Quebec style, the classic sort of French melodic black metal idea, and fans of Finnish black metal would appreciate it as well because there are strong guitar forward songs here. What stands out from my recollection is the some of the lead work on here is catchy. The songwriting is quite dynamic, and it's just a strong record that a lot of people overlooked, um, which I think it's worth reminding people of. So I've been a fan of atmospheric sludge metal since the mid '90s, and Northwest is a good argument for the modernization of that sound as opposed to post metal. And what I mean is, A Path Beyond Grief still keeps it doom oriented, still keeps it heavy, modernizes the production. Well, they've always sounded quite modern. They've had a string of very good albums in the past. I think this one just pulls it all together to where every note counts, every song is very good, and uh, if you need an example of atmospheric sludge metal being done not just well, but better than anyone else, like Northless have done it, with this record. It's it's a shame there isn't a lot more earnest fandom for atmospheric sludge these days, because post metal is sort of just the trendy directions it pulls people in. But this is a substantial record, and I think if I had spent more time going back to it and listening to it, it would have been higher on the list. It just didn't. I just didn't come back to it for whatever reason. Uh, so it definitely belongs here, though. It's quite good. So Liminal Shroud. This is an interesting record because it it's a leap. Uh, so everything that this I think Vancouver, British Columbia based, or somewhere in that Victoria probably, uh, black metal band. Uh, Everything they've done has been a leap in quality from the last. I can't wait to see what they do next, because uh, their demos were cool in their own way, a little bit primitively put together, a little bit typical, but impressive nonetheless. They put out an album. I think it was on Hypnotic Dirge Records. I could be wrong, and that was already impressive, if not entirely stylized in full. And all of that kind of flushes away when All Virtues Ablaze shows up. And this is like a, a really intense, very evocative black metal record with some vestigial death metal elements here and there that don't really ever interrupt the flow of the full listen. Um, I think this is, you really hear the band almost just suddenly fully matured on this record, and it blew me away when I picked it up. I think it was the best release of the month when it came out for my standards, and I didn't come back to it a ton beyond that point, but that's just a symptom of a constant influx of new things, and it was worth remembering. Sacrilegion. I think I put this record here. There's a lot of potential here. I don't think it's the most original record on this list, but in terms of melodic death metal that is heavy, traditional, has some modern influences, and has some fine compositional work throughout. This is a great example of, where melodic death metal should be explored more often nowadays. Um, Otherwise, yeah, I think there was uh, mastering the mechanics of this music and the interesting textures of death metal in a melodic state is pretty cool. I think that they either need to pick a catchy direction or something more rhythmically intensive that impresses with impresses with the rhythms rather than just functionally makes it all work. I think they're at that stage where they found what they do really well, but making a spectacle of it will sort of, you know, push something out into the open that will catch more ears rather than just the kind of the brutal plus melodic side of things. Yeah. Uh, Now, Eric Wagner's final, and I don't think this is his only solo recording, but this is the last thing that the last album he kind of partook in before he passed away, and it's fantastic. Like, I could not stop listening to this record. I'm such a fan of Trouble, and yeah, pretty much all of the records he's been on. Um, and I don't really stop in the '80s either. I think, oh man, like Trouble was basically the band that introduced me to stoner music at all, besides Cathedral and all that in the early '90s. I think, um, yeah, by 1995, when that Plastic Green Head, I think is what it was called, that was a huge record at the time. Even though at the time the self-titled was kind of the one that people were hoping to get more of, and I didn't quite follow some of his later on projects, so I had to kind of go back and catch up, and you'll see that some of this is more related to his more recent work in other bands. But what a way to remember the guy, and what a catchy, um, really personal and affecting record to get from him. I really wish he could have toured it in full, because I think a lot of people would have really responded to this work. Um, and I didn't see enough people talking about it in terms of end of the year. So I hope people will reevaluate that and pick in the lonely light of the morning back up. Um, Sedimentum is a death metal band, I believe, out of Quebec, and I let's see. I'm not going to use a French accent here, but Separation Morphogenesiac is kind of just a raunchy uh, early 90s style death metal record that is just littered with riffs. I think a lot of people thought this would be more of a death doom metal record based on their demo, and in fact, it's more involved. It is not necessarily Demolic-esque, but if you're a fan of like cerebral rot and that kind of thing, you'll understand what this band is doing right away and recognize it as fine work. Um, I it isn't massively memorable, but it doesn't need to be for what it is. And I think this is just kind of like one of those. Oh, it's a piece of authentic death metal art. It's that kind of appreciation for it, where I can pick it up, and they've developed this sound and style pretty well for being a fairly new band. And I think they probably have a better record in them down the way. But this is an awesome like debut full length that I came back to it pretty often. Um, Another Canadian artist, um, French Canadian, uh, Cauchemar. Anyway, so nightmare is what that means in French, and Rosa Mystica they put out a few records now, and I think Rosa Mystica is one of the more, um, I think more traditional, most traditional feeling of their work. I think it tells an interesting kind of story, which over the course, and this was just a fun record to return to. I liked the addition of the keyboards whenever they'd pop up. I think some of the best guitar work from the band shows up on this record, and I loved the pace of it. Yeah, I kept returning to it for this sort of grand feeling of the like occult story that was being told. It was pretty cool. Um, Now, in more of a modern doom metal side of things, Messa's. This is an Italian group, I believe, and Close is definitely a unique um, doom rock record, which is influenced by atmospheric rock and that kind of thing. It's very vocally driven. I think a lot of the more original aspects of this music come from the vocal cadence and delivery, and like I liked previous releases from the band, but this one really stuck with me, and it kind of crept up on me at the same time because I said, well, I mean, I trust what Smart Records puts out, but I don't know if this looks like anything I would ever listen to. And it turned out to be one of my favorite records that month. So, well, we're checking out. Um, in terms of getting an example, like 90s black metal is a big deal for a lot of people right now. Um, I think Faustian Spirit are one of the better bands playing in a classic style. They just delivered a solid, full listen. Nothing trendy, nothing geeky about this record. It's just a great black metal record that pulls back to the early second wave, and not the earliest second wave, but the more sophisticated piling of closer to like the '94 side of things. And I came back to this record a ton. I think I gave a short review of it in November, and it's just been an obsession all year. I just wasn't sure when it was released because I think it was delayed or something like that. But think all the members are Chilean, but I could be wrong. It still sounds like it's from Scandinavia in 1994. So definitely check that one out if you're a black metal fan. I won't say much about Earthless's Night Parade of 100 Demons. If you are interested in modern psychedelic rock and you don't get these long-winded kind of jam bands, um, at the very least you get some of the Sabbath vibes and the uh, blues rock jammed nature of this record, which um, it's a set of very long pieces, which you aren't really. It could be background music before you appreciate it. I wouldn't take it too seriously, but I found myself coming back to this record constantly, especially when I wanted something instrumental, which is granted not very often. But I I particularly like. I'll admit that I bought it just for the artwork on it. So, but I had listened to it probably like 50 times before I ended up buying it. So, uh, pretty substantial record as far as what I got out of it. I don't, it really depends if you're interested in psychedelic rock, longer jam pieces and whatnot, like I said. Peth's Merchant of Death. Again, this is very much an early Black Sabbath influenced group. I don't think any of them had made a record before. Uh, Maybe they were a covers band before. It's a Texas-based group, from what I remember. And Merchant of Death is just it's catchy, it's memorable, it's just everything you'd want from that heavy rock in the era of the first three Black Sabbath albums. And man, it just hit from the first listen. I think this is a great record. I like the kind of tongue-in-cheek occult themes of it. And yeah, it was a big deal. All right, finish death metal band Morbific and Squirm Beyond the Mortal Realm. Now, this is the band's second full length, and they've gone with a very stylized sound. For me, the bass sounds somewhere in between. Like, okay, their sound is somewhere in between. Like, like they sound like a Wild Rags band from like 1992, where there's like autopsy driving the ship. There's some impetigo in the attack of the music. There's a little bit of doom in there, like 91 autopsy, retribution for the dead kind of thing. And there's a little bit of nuclear death in there in terms of the sound design. The uh, the bass guitar sounds like it's just kind of exploding out of a guitar amp with a lot of just like overdrive on it. It's a cool sounding record, and I like that they're kind of pushing the limit of what their sound, and it sounds home brewed. It sounds cool, and there's a definite horror theme to everything they do, a supernatural horror theme. So these guys are young. I think it's great that writing they're doing what they want to do and what they're interested in. Clearly they're very into this like late 80s traditional death metal side of things, but also the horror metal aspect of it too. So uh, it definitely sounds better than the last album, but it's also kind of like more raunchy than the last album too in terms of the actual sound. So I like that. They're showing some personality up front and not worrying about how commercial their shit is. They're not like I think I follow them on social media and they're never pushing like, hey, 30 kinds of merch. They're just like, hey, listen to this great fucking album we put out. And I appreciate that. It's a cool band and I hope they put out more records right away. Um, Besiege is a band I've followed for quite a long time. I think, especially as a fan of Unspeakable Acts, I remember I picked up their most of their earlier releases, just because I will literally buy anything that sounds like Sepultura between 1983 and 1991. And these guys probably lean more towards the like Arise era or Beneath the Remains. It's a thrash metal band with some death metal influences, and they're excellent. I think this record, it just, it wasn't that it was in one ear and one out ear and out another, but it was, it didn't, uh, I didn't come back to it very often. And I don't know why that is, because I really enjoyed it. So it didn't spark up with me when I was making this list, but I am a big fan, and I would like to see more classic thrash metal influenced records year over year. I think this year was just a little bit dominated by death metal in per my own taste. Exordium Moors have been around for a while, quite a while. This is a New Zealand-based band, which they have always been compared to Absu, and I would probably compare their earlier stuff more to like Summon or uh, Black Thresh of a different era. But I think it does make sense to compare their sound to Absu based on how fast, technical, thrash influenced, and just generally impressive with how it all comes together. Like these guys are fantastic musicians. I think this is their best sounding record to date. I love that they've released it independently, and like this is a record people have completely slept on in terms of like if you like riffs, if you like heavy metal, if you like thrash metal, death metal, black metal, they're pushing the limits of what you can do in a way that you really only find again in a band like Absu. So definitely recommend that one if you've skipped out on it. I think if you love that kind of stuff, you're really going to love this album. And you just don't find enough people who are willing to put time into something new. Uh, I don't know how to pronounce that, but Måneskin from Witchblade. I think this is the second full length album from this band, and it's definitely a definite change of pace, a different sound. This is more interested in 70s heavy metal, heavy rock, traditional heavy metal. And for me, I get sort of early new wave of British heavy metal feeling from this record, with its own, I think, personality. And I think the vocalist is fantastic. The guitar work is great throughout this thing. I think if you're looking for like a 79 or maybe pre Killing Machine heavy metal sound, this is like a pretty special record that I didn't see anyone talking about. The album cover is kind of funny looking, but I like that hand drawn look, as you'll see with like the Strange Horizon album I pointed out earlier. So didn't see enough people talking about that, and definitely should have. Reincarnated is a death doom metal band out of Thailand. Yeah, if it's on Inhuman Assault, it's probably out of Thailand. And of Boots Void Death Spell is somewhere in between like a spectral voice influenced death metal band, death doom metal band, and like an incantation esque sound. It's a pretty great uh, band, and like it's one of those unique dark underground records that you're going to come back to in the future because it's something different. It's something you might have overlooked early on, but it's the kind of thing I zero in right away because it's like these guys are not, part of the crony scene or any bullshit like that, and they're making this cool record because they love this type of music. So you can kind of feel how they're feeling their way through this stuff and coming up with uh, a cool sound that's more their own with each release so far. I think they released a short demo before this, and this represents kind of an impressive leap beyond what they were doing on that demo. Kind of a short album, but I think if they iterate on this and kind of push it a little further, this is destined to be a pretty great band, and I like what the project is doing. Uh, I think a lot of people picked up Ashen Spire's record, didn't know what to do with it, and set it aside for a few months. And for me, I kind of understood what hostile architecture was right away, but it's it's maximal progressive metal, but in a black metal intensity. And It's just like it sounds like as many, there's a thousand hands going into this crumbling uh, event that is just expressive, well spoken, and uh, confrontational art, um, and not in a provocateur way, in a cerebral way. It's a very intelligent thesis made throughout this record that is worth parsing. It's really worth picking up this record and supporting it because I think, well, for one, the main guy behind this is just a huge talent. He sings on the Ponce's Nocturnes record that I'll talk about later on in the list up in like 49 or so. And this definitely deserves the how demanding it is. It's worth putting the time into it. Yeah. Now, on a completely different note, Greenbeard is not demanding at all. It's a feel-good stoner rock record, and that's all there is to it. These are catchy fly-by-night songs. It's just a great feeling record that was memorable from the moment I picked it up. It plays with blues rock, stoner rock, um, even a bit of metal here and there, but generally just has a good time with where it's going while expressing, existential dread and serious topics. And there was a lot that went into the development of this record, you know, as so many people did between 2020 and 2022. It wasn't an easy trip getting here. So I appreciated that they ended up putting out what I think is their best record through some adversity and having to switch members and all that stuff. So anyway, I really got into it, but at the same time, I wouldn't make that big of a deal of it unless you're into this kind of thing. Um, like it's not going to suddenly make you a stoner rock fan. It happens to be fairly sophisticated music for what it is. Now, I was going to put innumerable forms higher on this list, but when I went back to listen to it, it it wasn't that it was lacking anything. It's just that I had a list of so many more things to put ahead of it, and I found that I didn't really have the drive to re-listen to it 100 more times. And this is a symptom of me over-listening to it when it was released, because it was such an exciting thing. I think it's a um, I really enjoyed the first Innumerable Forms album, but I find that this one improves upon it in most every way, both in terms of the songwriting, which is just generally better. The guitar playing is much better here, and the inclusion of sort of British death doom metal influences pulls us away from that Finnish doom metal, death metal sound and towards something a little bit more personal. And I found myself listening to it quite a bit around the time of release to the point where I wore it. I definitely wore it out. So finally, Vorbid's A Swan by the Edge of Mandala is probably one of the more demanding thrash related records of the year. It is essentially a fusion of modern progressive Scandinavian progressive metal and like uh, progressive thrash metal, where I guess the closest thing would be like a Vector, that kind of thing. So you get both worlds, and it's such an impressive work. It's such an evocative work that tells like a very personal story. But finding that fan who likes aggressive, uh, like basically extreme thrash metal, but also likes very expressive modern progressive metal. It's not a very common fan, and I just appreciated that it's modern progressive thrash metal done in a very elaborate, and these guys are obviously very talented. As much as people criticized them for their harsh vocals on past releases, the the clean vocals here are just fantastic, very professional. So uh, I didn't go back to it beyond release, but I was, I definitely gave it a ton of time listening and obsessed over this record for a while I was writing about it. So from that point, I'll get into the top 75 probably in kind of 25 item chunks from here on. This is already getting too long of a video, so we'll work up there on the list from there. So there you go. Stay tuned.